our friends and students are already coming in. Yeah, excellent. So, good afternoon. Hello, students. Hello, international guests. I'm really happy to have the opportunity this afternoon to, introduce Henk Oosterling from Rotterdam. And, Henk is, I would say, Henk, and you correct me, an activist in terms of that his thinking that is very much founded in the idea of, bringing ecology to life and introducing a new approach towards how we live together, to bring that into the world, how to bring that into our Dasein, and probably to look at different strategies on how to do that. So we have this framework that we give Henk about 10 minutes to give us, a first idea of his thinking and of his approaches. And then we switch into our mode of discussion to get a little bit deeper into certain topics and, to have the opportunity to have a feedback in terms of questioning and response. So Henk, welcome very much in this format of the Institute of Architecture and Landscape here in Graz. And I would kindly invite you to start with your little introduction, please.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor, and it's very challenging to do it in 10 minutes, but let's just take a very broad perspective in order to situate the specific thematic of Dasein as design. So the way of thinking that I introduced is a transitional way of thinking. So we are in between two discourses. The old discourse has failed, in a sense, and the new discourse is not yet coherent and consistent. So, like Einstein said, we can't solve the problems with the concepts that created the problems. And that's more or less the problem that we have, that we need to reconceptualize our problems in different terms. So the main frame is a transition from what we called the human condition, and the human condition was focused on the individual and on a economy based on scarcity. It's focused on autonomy, right? And we're all shifting to a different arrangement where the individual is no longer as autonomous as we thought he was, and the realization that we are all embedded in networks in a way, and that we are no longer, if I would allow me a metaphor, on top of the pyramid, right? But that we are a node in a network. So in order to function within society, you need to free yourself from this idea of autonomy, individual, on top of the world, on top of the pyramid, and realize that we are always already situated in relations, in networks, right? So when I use the word Dasein, of course, this is a transitional term that Heidegger introduced, and that he introduced to criticize already the autonomous subject. So for me, Dasein is more or less a step towards this other discourse. So if I pinpoint a few terms, then the discourse is from pyramid to networks, or from linear to circular, or from exclusive to inclusive, or from identity to relations. So the primacy of relations, that's the idea behind this slogan of Dasein is design. So for me, a relation is always mediated. There is no relation as such. So we use a smartphone, we use a car, we use a plane, we have specific design food we all use design in a sense in order to articulate relations. So media, for me, are designed relations. So when I talk about Dasein as designed relations, when I talk about Dasein as design, then I change the ontology. The ontology is not some essence behind all those media, but the ontology is that this medium itself can't be detached from what it expresses. For instance, when Morton says ecology without nature, then this nature is not a thing over there, but it's a concept, right? So for me, Dasein is design is the realization that our being is primarily relational and at the same time mediated. So in order to act upon the world or to interrelate or to be interactive, we have to be completely aware of the medium that mediatizes this relation. So for me, the human condition is no longer an issue. For me, the Anthropocene condition is the issue. So what does it mean to have an Anthropocene condition? And that's where the eco-relational paradigm comes in, right? So if we want to define human existence within the present situation, for me, it is, and these are the two terms that I use in the articles. The first thing is that we are ontologically seen, and I call it in a bit of provocative way, we are living a radical mediocrity. Okay? So we are radicalized in the sense that radix means root. We are rooted in media. The only way that we can get knowledge of or become aware of the world is through the medium. So we are rooted in media, radicalized, and the measure of our daily acting is defined by media. So in German, Mittelmäßigkeit is the Maß der Mittel, right? So this radical mediocrity is a very uncritical state. We do not realize that we are radically mediocre because we are still thinking in terms of the old discourse. We are autonomous, we are individuals, while factually we are completely dependent upon our media, right? So, and I think that the present crisis, the COVID crisis, has made explicit how dependent we are upon those media. In the positive way that we can still interact while at the same time physically distancing ourselves from each other. But on the other hand, we are completely aware of the fact now suddenly that our behavioral patterns, our behavior, our needs need to be transformed into another pattern or coherency. So the let's call it viral panic, the panic of the virus. So the viral panic right this moment already gives us a first impression what it means to tackle the eco panic that will come after the viral panic. So in a sense, for me, Dasein is design is also a proclamation about how we have to make a transition to new behavioral patterns. And these behavioral patterns are eco-relational, right? So the most important thing for me is to change the radical mediocrity, or to make it explicit first, and then show the transformation from radical mediocrity to a state of mind that I called interesse, to be interested, right? So in a sense, this means, in a political sense, this means that we are always connected to everything else. So it's not that we have to choose to be engaged. We are ontologically engaged. We can choose not to be engaged. That's something else, right? But our ontological fact is we are engaged completely. and in a eco-relational way, in the sense that we are engaged in an ecosystemic way to all beings and all materials that we have created or that still are there in the world. So if we are going to talk about this, then we have to keep this in the back of our minds. I'm talking about an Anthropocene condition. What does this mean for architecture? What does it mean for philosophy, for instance? So for me, the transition from philosophy to a state of mind, an Anthropocene state of mind, means that philosophy has to become ecosophy, right? That's the implication for my specific discipline. And we can elaborate on what it means for architecture. So I think this is enough for an introduction. Let's just jump in and then we'll see where the conversation goes. But keep this at the back of your mind once we are going to talk about concrete practices and cases.
Right. Well, thank you so much for this high-speed introduction, which is a format that is, I think, very powerful as it is, of course, quite limiting. Right. But I think we're going to have now time to really deepen a few aspects of what you have been just tackling upon. I've had the opportunity yesterday to sit down with a number of students that were looking at your work, and I think we're pretty impressed by also the political aspect of your work. And one main question was, and relates directly to your introduction, right, about translation. How to translate that eco-relationality into design, right? Because apparently it's almost like there are living two people in us. There is a designer, and then there's me in my Dasein who understands, yes, I am the environment. I'm not just part of this, but I literally am the environment in regard to this idea of organism on networking, right? You can't separate a node in a network and say that's something else, but it's the network that has the existence. So I think this very valid question, okay, how can I translate that, my engagement, my my concern towards the environment, how can I translate that into design, into architecture?
Yeah. So first of all, the whole concept of design is broadened. It's opened up. In its strict sense, of course, design is an artistic discipline, right? And before, well, 50 years ago, it was called an applied art, like architecture. Architecture and design are applied arts. The irony, perhaps, I don't know whether it's irony, but at least nowadays, design and architecture are the focus points within art, right? And the autonomous artist has become a multimedia artist, right? So there's a strange shift where the applied arts now of yesterday has been the arts that are now telling the story of how coherent society is. So what does this mean for architecture, or for architects and for designers? First of all, the specific disciplinary meaning of design has to be broadened to an existential meaning. Okay, so our life, we design our life. If you look at the work of Michel Foucault, for instance, he's talking about an art of existence, right? An art of existence. So in a way, design has lost its disciplinary exclusivity and has become a all-over activity, because we are so informed and our society is so bombarded with possibilities, preferences, if you want the term. But so we have to choose every day, right? And especially when nowadays the eco-problematics has entered our daily life in a very strict way, we have to make choices, new choices and new decisions again. And those decisions and choices are design choices, right? But no longer in an exclusive disciplinary way, but in an existential way. So when you talk about an architect, can you divide your being an architect and as such being a designer in a disciplinary, exclusive way? Can you just how do you say, is there a gap between that professional way of looking at yourself and your daily life? I don't think you can. Once you are trying to fix both ways of being a designer, I think you're still in the human condition. The Anthropocene condition asks for you to reintegrate those two levels, and then the Dasein is design perspective is more or less opened. And then, of course, you have to talk about what does this mean strategically, tactically, operationally. What does it mean on a micro-political level, on a mesopolitical level, on a micro-political level? So you can differentiate, okay? But for me, design is first of all a existential problematic. And then in a feedback loop to the discourse that we left behind, it's an exclusive disciplinary perspective, but it's not separated from the existential design.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think this integration is something that we certainly foster at the institute with our students, and also, sharing with them and confirming, of course, yes, of course. Also, your thinking is meaningful and political, right? We are not doing dry exercises in this separate forum of academics, and then after class is over, you go out in the world again. I think that is already one very important realization to make, that whatever you engage in, whatever you engage with, whatever task you take on at our school, this has already impact to the larger society, and is political in a way.
Everything is political in the sense. Also, the whole concept of politics has to be differentiated as well. When you accept the definition of politics as changing existing power relations as a definition for politics, then of course the power relation on a geopolitical level and a macro political level do not qualitatively are not qualitatively different from the mesopolitical level, the professional level you're working on. And these, on the mesopolitical level, these power relations are not qualitatively different from the micropolitical power relations that are within me, right? So when just an example, when I want to change my needs and my behavioral patterns, I don't want to eat meat, I don't want to fly any longer, for instance, with whom do I speak in the last instance? With myself. So who is the self in me that I'm talking to say, you are not going to eat meat, you are not going to fly? And who's that other guy that says, fuck you, I'm going to fly to this and that, and I want to eat meat, so I'll eat meat. So there the power relation, the discourse is in me. So we have to cover the whole spectrum of politics in order to come to the very important eco-relational departure point, and that's in here. So it's about consciousness, right? About mental ecology, as Bateson called it, mental ecology.
Exactly. I fully agree. And, a student yesterday asked, that question, okay, are we actually equipped as students? Are we ready, right, for taking that on, right? Once realizing that of course I am political, and I do make that difference, right? Because I can't outsource politics.
There's no outside any longer. Nothing
Exactly.
can be externalized any longer.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the feedback loop makes that everything is already here before it's here.
Mm.
One way or the other, it'll come back to you, right? So there's no outside any longer. That's the whole idea of eco-relationality.
Mm.
Okay, but when you go back to your first question, so how can students be equipped to act as a eco-relational architect, right? This question is addressed to the institution, of course, to the pyramid we call university, right? So if we teach our students only the skills and the knowledge of the old discourse and don't connect them while studying with society, then they won't learn how to act once they leave the university. So we have to redress our institutions to learning organizations and not pyramidal top-down organizations in order to open up already during the study for being equipped with the skills that we need to handle an Anthropocene condition.
Yeah, I think there are certainly ways to at least address that issue. Also in our course, and even having you, I think, is already, and having the other guests is already an undertaking, right? To reach out and to understand that that immediate design has impact to a larger reality, and also the thinking and being of you and others has immediate impact on that design, and to not separate the university as an institutional entity from that larger reality anymore. I would like to still stay with the idea of eco-relationality, because once you get really into the topic of ecology and say, okay, biodiversity, also the micropolitics of bacteria, of your biome, of your inside, right? There's an immediate relationship to be drawn, of course, to the immediate environment of your house, of the building that you design, of the environment surrounding.
Am Anfang haben wir
Yeah. Of the environment surrounding those buildings, and we tended to create those disciplinary separations. There's architecture separated from landscape, yeah, separated from ecology, and that is, of course, quite a task to say, well, those separations don't exist, and we have engaged in separating for a long time. And we don't have to engage in drawing things together, because that's the condition of life on this planet. Yeah. But we no longer have to invest in separation, right? Yeah. As we are in a transitional phase, as you mentioned earlier, how would you approach that task of drawing this all together?
Also, so first of all, we have to realize that everything we do is connected to everything else, dependent upon time and distance and so on. But so once we realize that as an architect, we have to, for instance, within a urban planning, the moment we get a commission for doing a certain building or a certain neighborhood, we have to understand that in developing this idea from the beginning, other stakeholders need to be involved from the beginning, not in the end, but from the beginning. So what does this mean for the public space or the social space? So all these elements need to be integrated, I think, in the education of an architect at university. So how that was my former answer to your question. So how are we going to develop the skills to collaborate right? And and how do we develop the skills to communicate? Because first, if you can't communicate with other parties because you think they are irrelevant or they do not have the mindset to think about urban planning, once you already have this precondition, then collaboration is not an issue, it's impossible.
I mean,
So
there are
these skills, 21st century skills, for instance, if you take the 21st century skills, these are 4 C's: communication, collaboration, critical thinking, creative innovation, and 2 new literacies, which should be part of the education as well: media literacy and eco-literacy.
right.
And the last one is lifelong learning. So are these integrated into the education? That's the question.
Right. I would like to actually exactly take up this idea of eco-literacy, because some of those partners that you say okay, they have to be on the plane from the beginning, right? Can't speak because they are plants, for instance, right? Or they are animals, and I think that's what we certainly would like to take on as a task at our institute, right? To exactly enlarge that circle, right, of collaborators to also to those more than humans. And
that's the reason why that's the reason, Klaus, that's the reason why I no longer speak about the human condition, but about the Anthropocene condition. So it's about ecological beings, not human beings. Right?
Yeah. I mean, for us, this is still, let's say, a task that we call even to be very playful, to think, okay, how can we introduce, the trees as collaborators, and give them a voice. Yeah. And I mean, that even can take on some schizophrenic kind of conditions, right? Once we speak for the trees, but I think for me there's no way around yet to approach it that way, to say, okay, well, I have to speak for those other partners that just don't have that speak the same language that we do, but certainly have a language, right? We do understand that trees do communicate very well among each others and among even other plants and other plant communities. So there is communication, among communities in the plant world, certainly, and that certainly also includes the animal world. Then, and I think for us it's quite a big task, because it seems to be so ontologically separated. At least that's where we are coming from, right? Saying, what, you're talking about a tree that doesn't have a voice, or an animal, but in that new condition that you're describing, right, that's just the basis of a real condition that we have to find new ways of how to how to unfold that beingness, this being with this co-Dasein, as we describe it in our course. Which becomes quite, complex, at least.
Yeah. So the first dilemma is that we always approach things and other beings from an anthropocentric perspective, right? So that's why I don't speak about anthropocentric, but Anthropocene. So what does it mean? It means that we have to develop the sensibility with other beings. In philosophy, bioethics or animal rights is a big issue, because they can have rights, but they can't have duties, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a problem. So who is the representative of the other beings in order to protect their rights? That's an old discussion. Nowadays, we have to, Latour has did all those big conferences where the oceans were not represented, but they talked in terms of oceans and of trees and so on. So the main issue, of course, is the issue of education. So I'm doing all those projects in Rotterdam, and primary schools, secondary schools, and the eco-literacy for those kids is to realize that everything they do has consequences for other beings. That's why we have them garden their fruits themselves and their vegetables, and in order for them to understand that they are not in control, that the bigger issue is climate or weather or whatever, sun or whatever. So if you want to have people to become more eco-literate, the first thing is, of course, to change your education in primary schools. That's the first thing. In order for people to become more sensible and to communicate on different levels without the discursive tools that we have. What it means for an architect. Yeah. What does it mean? For me, it means this architect has to be sensible in the way I just described it, eco-literate, right? And then it's not the architect that decides upon whether or not a forest is chopped down or is not chopped down. It's a whole network of stakeholders where the trees are only one party, but there are also other interests that have to be weighed in a way to make a strategy for that specific landscape. So these are very, the way we talk about it is already problematic, because it's always the talking of the human about something else, right? So for me, the main condition is a sensibility that we have to redress in order to make those decisions more balanced in ecological terms.
Can I just jump with a brief question? Or Klaus, do you want to go on?
Yeah, no, Chris, I just ask you if you want to pose a question.
Great, because it was just also resonating with me, Henk, while you were speaking. So thanks a lot for all your thoughts that you're currently bringing in now, and also your thinking has been really relevant also to my work and to also my PhD thesis. So, and now as we speak, I think when you're speaking about this sensibility, I think this is a concept that is so urgent. Also, when we speak about the modes of practicing, also the practices that we have as architects. So I was just curious also in the way how you're describing your work and your project as something ecosophical. So, and this of course for me immediately relates to Félix Guattari and to his project, and to when he's speaking about new practices, new strategies, new sensibilities, as well also new aesthetics. So I was wondering, and I was also reviewing again the three ecologies also in preparation of our talk, which also is already almost 30 years old. So I was wondering, are we still in this ecosophical way, or as we just discussed, is the ecosophy something that is now bringing us more into eco-literacy, or in how way also is the ecosophical project maybe changing also in your view, and in how you consider yourself as an ecosopher?
Yeah, to start with the last, of course, it is a transitional movement, so it changes all the way, right? But when you refer to Guattari, one of the most inspiring thoughts of the ecosophy of Guattari is this threefold ecology: the physical ecology, the social ecology, and the mental ecology. And the mental ecology is taken from Bateson, right? The social ecology is taken from, well, eco-anarchists in America, like Bookchin, right? Murray Bookchin. And the physical ecology is the conventional ecology, environmentalism, right? So when I talk about ecology, I always talk about this eco-3, as I call it, right? So the moment you are, for an architect, if we translate this back to the architect practices, it means that an architect has to make a evaluation of the situation always on those three levels. On a physical level, so what I'm going to build, what are the materials that I use, what's the footprint of the material, how does it fit into an existing situation when I put this building over there or develop the neighborhood like this? That's the physical aspect. The social aspect, of course, is how do I enhance and strengthen the relations of people living in that specific area that I'm going to build? So how can I influence the social coherency with my building? The last one, the mental ecology, of course, has to do with the fact that people are influenced by buildings the way as Foucault has described it in his disciplining thesis. So we are, since Foucault at least, but also before that, but we are aware of the fact that the consciousness of people changes when we change the building as well. So physical, social, and mental ecology are parts of this eco-literacy that I'm talking about. And everyone who is working, coming from an exclusive disciplinary situation, has to leave behind that specific aspect of the discipline and has to reintegrate his expertise into this threefold ecology. Right?
Yeah, definitely. I would totally agree. And I think also that's why also Guattari is also so valid for us as architects or as people who think about also the environment. I'm just wondering also if this kind of threefold, now as we're speaking about this Anthropocenic condition, perhaps this threefold is even also mutating. Perhaps it's not about maybe these three instances which were still maybe centered about the human as Guattari and his critique and on Lacan and so on. So perhaps this is also broadening or even becoming open up, that we not speak about maybe three instances that are relating or negotiating with each other, but perhaps we are arrived or we are still departing from a condition where there are actually more than those three instances. That's why I also find it really intriguing that you somehow put the ecosophical perspective in your book at the very end. So it's a kind of, it's the end of the book, but it's also an outlook to something new. So, and perhaps to something new where we still refer to Guattari, but maybe we still broaden our minds up in regard also to the modern human sphere that we just talked about before.
Okay, I agree. There's a lot of Hegel in Guattari still, right? So we are not yet, we not yet have left Hegel behind, right? And you don't need Zizek to understand that. But so the Guattarian framework is still pyramidal centered, like it is with Negri and Hart as well, of course. So this is a transitional configuration. And of course, once we go through the transition, once we do not collapse and just end, but we manage to deal with climate crisis, then of course, ecosophy changes and we'll have a completely different connective force than only those three that Guattari could find out in criticizing the pyramidal and the hierarchical way of thinking. So, and then it's more Deleuzian in a sense, the rhizomatic in a sense. But even if you take Deleuze as a marker, we have to realize that the connectivity always needs a feedback loop in order to create coherence and consistency, right? So it's not a matter of just connecting. We have to feedback loop the connection and anchor it in a existing coherency. So in that sense, all those different connections can change the idea of ecosophy, of course. But we can't just look over the horizon. It's impossible. We have to walk to the horizon, then there's a new horizon, then we see what was before and which has changed. So the landscape will change while walking through the landscape.
Well, talking about horizon, you know, maybe that's the moment to ask. Okay, you have been, you know, exposed to Japanese culture, you know, extensively, and in that regard, right, where we talk about maybe a different relationality, or a different way of being with, is just something that we can take from from different cultures. We talked about interculturality earlier, and I'm wondering, right, how would and what would you make available to us in regard to that thinking from Japanese culture, for instance?
Yeah. So to open up that line of thinking, I have to go back first to Heidegger and then to Arendt. Because Heidegger, Dasein, introduced also another word, another concept, Interesse. Right? And Interesse, to be interested, was taken by Hannah Arendt. And for Hannah Arendt, it was not focused on mortality, zum Tode sein, but on natality, being born. So Interesse for me is a creative concept. When you take this idea of Interesse, being in between, and you look at other cultures, for instance, Japan, then this in between is then you find concepts that are related, or that are more or less overlap this idea of Interesse. And while studying Japanese culture, there were two very important concepts. The first concept was the idea of ma. Ma is a Japanese concept, and it means dynamic interval, in between. When you look at the work of Isozaki, an architect for that matter, ma is fundamental for his way of thinking about space. So ma is the space, the dynamic space in between. So his buildings, his volumes are built out of this idea of the in-between. And in Japanese houses, of course, we have those slide doors, the shoji. You see them at the back of me. So why do they have slide doors? They have slide doors because they can change the space according to the social interaction that need to take place. When there's something very important, everything opens. When someone like me comes in, everything closes. So I lived in a box for 6 months in Japan because I'm not important. So the dynamics is located in the social relations in Japan, right? Architecture is anchored in social relations. After the Second World War, the human sciences were introduced in the Japanese universities, and they had to translate Western concepts like person. So that they translated the word person in Japanese, they call it ningen. Ningen literally means a being of the in-between. So a person in Japanese is called an in-between being, Interesse. Because the only thing that the Japanese, we call them people that are living in groups, a group being. But it's completely different. They are beings that always are aware of the fact that they create a relation in being somewhere. They are carrying relations, not identities. Okay, we call it etiquette or we call it formal, but in the Japanese state of mind, it is closing the breaches in order to restore harmony. Harmony is very important. So that's what inspired me to think about in-betweenness and architecture, for that matter, in a completely different way, right? And Isozaki organized in 1979 in Paris a big exposition on Ma, in which he more or less created installations that you have to walk through in order to experience, to become sensible for Ma. This sensibility, for me, is an eco-relational sensibility. And in that sense, it's connected to architecture, in the case of Isozaki.
Right. I mean, I fully agree. And I think that is quite a very beautiful example to realize, right, how your individual openness to other cultures and to other ways of being with are not something to be seen as just traditional or historical, but as very relevant in drafting, our current future. I think the idea of interesse, also translates very much into an eco relationality, of course, and this in between that you described, in the Japanese Ma, but also in the, in what we as humans are, actually, strongly relational, as it is being practiced in Japanese culture, also translates beautifully into the idea of being more than human, of course, right? If you understand that you are in that relationship with more than human entities, I think this gives a lot of space for thinking approaches also in architecture. How can I be really with the plants, right?
Now you are referring to the sensibility that I was talking about.
Yes.
Right. So yes. The psychological setting of interest is very interesting, because being interested means being open, no expectations, being very curious, trying not to anticipate too much. So this is not a human thing. This is a being thing, in a sense. So interbeing, ningen, is exactly the translation for the Japanese for our Western idea of individual. So that's why I do not speak about individuals any longer, but about dividuals, right? We are not, individual means not being divided. So that's the autonomous, essential individual of the modern discourse. If you talk about dividual, then we are defined by the split that I was talking about. It's not Lacan, it's a different split. But we are defined by this reflective tension where we always have to make choices, make decisions. That's where design comes in again. On an ontological level, because you make different choices than me. So on an individual level or a political level, it can change. But the fact that we are so informed and at the very same time so connected by media to everything means that we are in a state of mind that we have to make decisions, that we have to make choices. And this is exactly my definition of Dasein as design. It's a new condition. It's an Anthropocene condition, right? The human condition is Hannah Arendt. The Anthropocene condition is beyond human conditions. It's what Timothy Morton calls ecological beings, right?
Hank, thank you so much. We are already way beyond our, self-imposed time frame. But I think you're leaving us with a lot of inspiration for now. And as I asked earlier, we would be happy to get back, with you on a maybe more informal level with the students, where we can ask everybody to be with us and talk and share thoughts in a different format. But for now, I think again, you leave us with a lot of inspirations on many levels that we are very eager to discuss already tomorrow at our second midterm critics that we are going to have with the students, and are very excited to learn how the students are going to introduce that thinking into their further design development, the further Dasein, so to say. Thank you so much, Henk.
Okay, thanks very much for the opportunity. So thank you all.
Thank you.
So welcome. Take good care, and we see.
And perhaps after the lockdown, we just can go to Graz and have a decent conversation about those things.
Yes, with some very excellent Austrian wine, I can promise.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Take good care. All right. Bye-bye.